Like, subscribe, and comment if you're ready to hear a story they never want you to know. Because what happens over a tray of food at Rikers Island can decide who lives and who doesn't. The moment the metal cart rolled into the housing unit, the room exploded. Inmates surged forward, voices clashing off stained concrete walls as guards barked orders that nobody listened to. Steam curled from the lids of dented steel pans packed with something calling itself beef stew. The smell alone was wrong. Sour, chemical, edged with rot. Then someone screamed. An inmate named Marcus Hill dropped his tray, clutching his throat, convulsing as if his body had suddenly turned against itself. Foam gathered at the sides of his mouth. Within seconds, he collapsed face first onto the filthy floor. Chaos erupted. Men backed away. Guards rushed in. Medics followed, pushing through the mob, yelling for space. But it was too late. Marcus Hill stopped moving before they even reached him. The word spread fast and sharp, like a razor blade sliding through the unit. Someone had poisoned the food. That single death ignited a storm of panic and suspicion inside Rikers Island, exposing something far darker than a contaminated kitchen. Because Marcus Hill hadn't been the real target. And the truth behind that cafeteria meltdown would reveal a twisted psychological battlefield where food wasn't nutrition, it was power. And no one would understand that reality until it was already too late. 3 months earlier, Marcus was just another inmate trying to survive life behind the walls of Rikers. Arrested on a low-level robbery charge he swore he didn't commit, he was placed in a housing unit packed beyond capacity. Bunks were stacked like prison bunkers, sweat lingered in the air, and tension never left the room. Nights were loud. Days were worse. At Rikers, food wasn't about hunger. It was currency. Extra trays meant protection. Unopened desserts bought favors. Seasoning packets became bargaining chips. Trust was measured by what you were willing to trade or refuse at mealtime. If a man handed you his apple without asking for something in return, it meant something was wrong. Marcus learned the rules quickly. Keep your head down. Eat fast. Never stare when someone else sits down at your table. And when the food cart came through, never be first in line unless you wanted people watching your back. But Marcus had a problem that set him apart. He worked sanitation detail in the kitchen. That job gave him something few inmates had: access. He saw where the food came from. He watched the deliveries roll in, low-quality meat wrapped in leaking plastic, produce already wilting, boxes stamped with expiration dates nobody seemed to care about. He watched inmate workers skip gloves, reuse cutting boards smeared with blood from raw chicken and old beef. He noticed how inspections were announced days ahead of time, giving staff enough notice to fake compliance. And then he saw something worse. One afternoon, while shoveling trash near the commissary prep room, Marcus overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. 2 inmates spoke in hurried whispers about mixing cleaning solvent into a pot of soup, not as some random act of violence, but as a message, a warning to a rival group controlling contraband food flow inside the unit. In Rikers, the food hustle ran deeper than anyone outside could imagine. Certain gangs controlled access to extra trays, grocery deliveries from commissary, and even clean meals for inmates who paid protection. Food meant strength. Strength meant loyalty. Loyalty meant survival. Poisoning a meal wouldn't kill the whole block. It wouldn't need to. It only needed to scare everyone. Prove control over the most basic thing a human needs to live. Marcus reported what he heard to a correction officer, hoping someone would do something. Nothing happened. Instead, after that day, subtle threats started appearing in his world. His bunk was tossed. His commissary orders came up short. Someone scrawled "Snitch eats last" across the mirror in the bathroom. Marcus tried to lie low. He stayed off the kitchen detail for 2 weeks, faking illness. He stopped talking to guards. He avoided any group he didn't recognize. But the damage was already done. Word spreads fast inside Rikers, faster than the truth ever can. The gangs believed Marcus had exposed something, and whether he actually had or not didn't matter. He knew too much. When he finally returned to housing after missing several days of meals, his body was weak. His mind was shot. And the food cart that night rolled in with a new batch of stew, thicker than usual, darker than before. Someone had tampered with one tray. No one knew which one. Marcus grabbed at random, tried taking a seat near the back wall, and ate fast like he always did. Head down, eyes lowered, spoon scraping plastic. Then the burning started. Not in his stomach, in his throat. Like swallowing acid. His vision blurred as the chemical smell hit his lungs too late for him to react. He tried to stand, tried to speak. The collapse came before the scream. Hours after Marcus died, a testing lab confirmed the truth. Industrial-grade cleaning solvent had entered the food, enough to kill one person rapidly, not enough to harm anyone else. It was targeted. But here's where the case took its most disturbing turn. The investigation revealed that the poisoned tray hadn't been intended for Marcus at all. It was meant for another inmate, a gang lieutenant who never showed up to dinner that night. Marcus had taken the wrong tray. His death wasn't part of a grand plan. It was collateral damage, a mistake in a system where human lives were as disposable as cafeteria plates. The truth came out quietly. No names officially released. No arrests announced. The case paperwork gathered dust while Rikers returned to business as usual. And for everyone left behind in that housing unit, one thing became painfully clear. At Rikers Island, prison food wasn't about feeding people. It was a psychological weapon. And Marcus Hill paid the price for learning that too late. Marcus Hill's body left the unit on a stretcher, but the shock stayed behind. That night, no one in the cell block touched their food. Plastic trays sat sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights while inmates stared at their meals as if they might suddenly bite back. Hunger meant nothing after you've witnessed a man die, choking on chemical poison. Every whisper, every side-eyed glance now carried a heavy weight of suspicion. Nobody trusted anyone. By sunrise, the rumors had twisted and morphed into a dozen different stories. Some said it was gang retaliation, a message sent in the most brutal way possible. Others claimed the guards themselves had sabotaged the kitchen, a quiet act of control. A few even insisted the food supplier was sending rotten shipments that had finally turned lethal. The truth was impossible to separate from the gossip that kept everyone on edge. And that confusion, that gnawing uncertainty, was the perfect fuel to keep the fear alive. The jail administration knew they had a crisis on their hands, but you wouldn't know it from their actions. Instead of addressing the block or making any official announcements, they moved in silence. The food prep areas were suddenly, temporarily secured. The inmate kitchen crews were rotated out without any explanation. Supervisors would walk through, doing surface-level checks that looked official but solved nothing. There were no arrests, no real interrogations. It felt less like a genuine response and more like a desperate cleanup, a way to keep the story from hitting the headlines. Back on the housing floor, behavior shifted overnight. The cafeteria, once a neutral space, was now a psychological minefield. Inmates would wait, watching each other, letting someone else take the first bite before they'd even consider touching their own meals. Some started trading trays, hoping that pure randomness could protect them. Others skipped meals entirely, choosing the gnawing pain of hunger over the paralyzing fear of poison. The gangs, of course, recognized opportunity in the chaos. Fear became a business. Certain crews began claiming they could guarantee clean food for the right price. Untouched trays, extra servings, and priority spots in the kitchen line were auctioned off in hushed side deals. If you had money coming in from the outside, you could keep eating normally. Everyone else just watched as their ribs started to show under their thin jumpsuits. Control tightened with every single mealtime. Through all of this, one man kept watching. His name was Raymond Carter, and he wasn't your typical inmate. In his former life, he'd managed supply warehouses and food chain transport routes. He understood distribution systems, logistics, and patterns. And inside Rikers, he started noticing things most others missed. He tracked which inmate workers rotated through the prep areas. He saw who handled the delivery carts. He noted which guards lingered near specific doors during food service. One name kept surfacing again and again: Travis "Tone" Walker. Ray noticed that Tone always seemed to be hovering near the stew bins just moments before the trays were sent out. Then there was Lucas Dean, a quiet inmate who unofficially monitored access to the cleaning storage room. Dean always had an excuse to be inside that room right before dinner service began. One evening, Ray's suspicions exploded into terrifying certainty. He was hauling trash from the prep zones when he paused near the mop sink. There, partially hidden behind a stack of buckets, Ray saw it. He watched as Tone tilted a small, unmarked bottle and poured a clear liquid into the corner of a stew pan. He didn't mix it through the entire batch, just contaminated a tight corner. A quick stir, and Tone slid the pan into place on the service line as if nothing had happened. Ray's stomach turned to ice. This wasn't random chaos. It wasn't an accident. This was targeted poisoning. The method was designed to hit one person per night, not dozens. It was a strategy to create maximum terror without triggering a full-scale lockdown and a real investigation. Ray thought about alerting the staff, but he knew how dangerous that was. In prison, informants rarely survive. So he compromised. He quietly reported his concerns to a grievance counselor named Michael Brooks. He spoke cautiously, mentioning the use of cleaning solvents, suspicious food handling, and the possibility of controlled contamination. But he withheld the names, afraid of retaliation. Brooks took notes. He promised to pass the information up the chain of command. And then, nothing changed. 3 days later, the poison struck again. This time, the victim lived. An inmate named Daniel Wright collapsed after a single bite of contaminated casserole, vomiting violently. Guards rushed him to the medical unit just before his system shut down completely. The doctor said it was risky treatment that saved his life. Now, there could be no more denial. 2 poisonings, one fatal, one barely survivable, confirmed a deliberate, horrifying pattern. A new wave of fear locked the unit into a tense silence. The word on the block was that chemtrails were being marked for punishment. Anyone accused of being disloyal or stepping out of line either skipped their meals or paid hefty protection fees to the gangs. Gang control deepened, and the fear economy boomed. Ray now knew something truly chilling. The poisoning operation wasn't slowing down. It was expanding. And if the administration continued to pretend they didn't see it, then the only people exposed to the danger were the inmates themselves. Somewhere inside Rikers, another tray was already being contaminated. Another unsuspecting man was stepping forward in the chow line, completely unaware that he had been selected, without ever knowing why. The silent terror continued, and for the men trapped inside, every meal was a roll of the dice. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe. The second poisoning changed everything. Daniel Wright survived, but his near-death experience sent a tremor through Rikers Island. The facility's leadership could no longer pass off Marcus Hill's death as a tragic accident. 2 incidents meant a pattern. A pattern meant a public risk. And at Rikers, public risk brings attention. The one thing administrators hated more than the chaos inside their own walls. For the first time since the poisonings began, the cameras suddenly mattered. The kitchen surveillance footage, which had been ignored for weeks, was finally reviewed in rushed, overnight sessions. The recordings were grainy, the angles were terrible, half-blocked by stacked crates and swinging metal doors. But investigators managed to pull stills. They found images of inmate workers stepping near cleaning supply stations, of men hovering over food pans for just a little too long. The pictures confirmed what an inmate named Ray Carter already knew in his gut. Someone had figured out how to make murder invisible. But the investigation never reached the housing units. The leadership was terrified of the riots that would erupt if inmates learned that poison was on the menu. So instead of transparency, they chose secrecy. Guards quietly rotated the kitchen workers. New inmate crews were brought in. The chemical solvents were locked up, but only for about a week. Then, as it always does, routine crept back in. And so did the poisonings. Ray noticed it first. He always did, because he watched the food like a hawk. He saw the subtle changes in the patterns. Certain inmates were suddenly getting special meal trays, pulled aside just before distribution. Gang spotters started mapping the exits right before dinner. Whispers were exchanged near the condiment racks. This wasn't just chaos anymore. This was coordination. One afternoon, a skinny, nervous inmate named Anthony Reyes pulled Ray aside in the hallway. His eyes were darting everywhere. "They're using the kids from the laundry crews," Anthony whispered. "It's not the kitchens. They move the solvent in detergent bottles. They switch the labels so the guards don't check." Ray's heart started pounding. This meant the poisoning network had expanded. It wasn't just about manipulating food in the kitchen anymore. This was logistics. This was a supply chain. They weren't just testing the poison now. They were deploying it. Ray tried to get the warning to someone, anyone, higher up. He slipped notes into grievance boxes. He tried flagging down random supervisors. He even wrote an anonymous letter to a city oversight hotline. But no answers ever came back. Only threats. One night, Ray returned to his cell to find his mattress slashed wide open. A crude message was sewn into it with rusted wire. "Watch what you eat." The gangs were done with subtlety. They wanted their fear to be loud. And they knew someone was talking. That single act pushed Ray into full survival mode. He stopped eating the everyday trays completely. He started living on sealed commissary foods and ramen packets that trusted inmates would secretly pass to him. But countless other men didn't have a network like that. Within 2 weeks, another man showed poisoning symptoms. This time, it was mild, almost controlled. It was just enough to keep the headlines quiet when the medical staff reported no fatalities. But the fear festered. In a way, the mild poisoning was even more unsettling than death because it proved the threat was ongoing, that it could happen to anyone at any time. Gang leaders started using the poison trays as a tool for psychological enforcement. They'd warn their targets, skip dinner tonight, or next time, you won't be skipping the ambulance ride. Some men obeyed. Others challenged the threat. One of those challengers was a tall inmate named Victor King. He was a former semi-pro boxer, locked up at Rikers while awaiting trial. Victor flat out refused to pay the extortion demands for safe meals. He openly mocked the poisoning stories, calling them nothing more than scare tactics. That defiance sealed his fate. Ray sensed it before it happened. He saw Victor's name passed in hushed conversations near the sink stations. He watched the gang enforcers, Tone and Lucas, exchange knowing nods during meal prep. Ray even tried to warn Victor, but in prison, pride can be fatal. Victor just laughed it off. "Nobody's poisoning me," he said. "If they want me, they can come get me like real men." The next evening, Victor sat down with his tray, mashed potatoes, a chicken cutlet, and canned peaches. Halfway through the meal, he stopped chewing. His eyes went glassy. Violent muscle spasms twisted his arms inward. He slid right off the bench and hit the floor hard, his face cracking against the concrete. This time, it was different. Everyone backed away instantly. There were no screams, no chaos. Just a heavy, knowing silence. The medics rushed in. Victor was barely breathing. He survived, but with severe nerve damage that would never fully heal. The message was now crystal clear. Resistance gets you poisoned. From that night forward, the entire food system turned into open extortion. The gangs controlled who ate and who starved. Men had to pay for safety servings. Entire tables in the mess hall became segregated by loyalty. If you sat in the wrong spot, you ate the wrong food. And through it all, the guards acted completely blind. Ray finally understood the ugly truth. This wasn't a problem that was slipping through the cracks. This was happening inside the cracks that the authorities refused to seal. The poisoning didn't threaten the order of the prison. It created a new order. Fear created compliance, which meant that nobody in a position of power was truly motivated to stop it. But in figuring this all out, Ray had unknowingly crossed a dangerous line. He had gone from being a witness to being a liability, because the gangs now knew one thing for certain. Someone inside was mapping their entire poison system. And if Ray didn't disappear soon, he would become the next tray marked for death. By the time the third poisoning hit, nobody was pretending anymore. The housing unit ran on fear now, not order. Every meal felt like a gamble. Men would stare at their trays longer than they ate from them. Some guys waited, watching to see who else was chewing before they'd even lift a fork. Others poured salt over everything, convinced it might neutralize whatever chemicals were hiding in the food. Logic didn't matter, panic did. The gangs had become the unofficial food authority. They controlled everything. They decided which inmates worked in the kitchen, who loaded the food carts, and even which tables were considered safe zones during chow time. If you wanted a clean tray, a meal you knew wasn't tampered with, you had to pay. If you refused to pay, you had two choices: skip meals entirely or risk playing roulette with poison. Ray Carter tried to stay under the radar as long as he could. He was quiet, observant. He kept logging time patterns in his head. When did the supply deliveries come in? When did the guards change their posts? Which inmates always seemed to be lingering near supply closets? He started connecting the dots, and the network he uncovered was far more complex than he first imagined. It wasn't just about the two big players, Tone Walker and Lucas Dean. There were runners from the laundry crews, moving relabeled detergent bottles into kitchen access points. There were spotters watching the security camera angles, and lookouts watching the guards even more closely than they watched the other inmates. This whole operation ran smoothly because everyone involved was desperate to avoid attention, to blend into the chaos. Ray soon learned the gangs weren't just punishing their enemies. They were controlling entire tiers of the prison population through compliance. Prison politics used to revolve around brute force and violence. Now, It revolved around something far more fundamental: appetite. And the administration? They still hadn't acted. It was as if nothing was happening at all. Then, something new began: the food tests. Suddenly, officers would show up and collect random meal trays for chemical screening. But these were always announced inspections. The gangs always seemed to know days ahead of time when they were coming. And so, predictably, every single test came back clean. Official public records showed no ongoing contamination issues. On paper, the problem never existed. That's when Ray realized the horrifying truth. The poison network had insiders, people feeding information up the chain. Someone wasn't just ignoring the operation. Someone in a position of power was actively protecting it. That knowledge, that single realization, cost him his anonymity. One night, while brushing his teeth, Ray looked up and caught his reflection in the tiled bathroom mirror. And standing just behind him, way too close for comfort, was Lucas Dean. Lucas just stared at him for a second and said calmly, "You see too much." Before Ray could even process what was happening, Lucas stepped away and vanished back into the crowd. It was the first direct warning. That same night, Ray packed what little he had: old letters, some snacks from the commissary, and all his notes, scratched onto razor-thin scraps of paper. He knew he couldn't do this alone anymore. He started looking for allies. He found two other inmates who were willing to listen. Anthony Reyes, the same guy who had first whispered to him about the laundry runners, and Marcus Pollard, an ex-cell block porter who lost 30 pounds after refusing to pay for safe meals. Together, the three of them formed a fragile triangle of information. They shared what each of them had seen, but they were careful, never meeting in groups larger than two. Piece by piece, they put the puzzle together, and their intelligence matched perfectly. The poison program had a clear structure. The laundry crews smuggled in the solvents. The kitchen prep inmates applied the poison to specific zones on the trays. The spotters verified that the target got the right tray during chow seating. And at the very top, there was a coordinator, someone unknown, unseen, who decided who would be targeted and why. They had a lot of speculation, but what they needed was proof. So, Ray Carter made the most dangerous decision of his life. He decided to make himself the bait. He stopped paying the protection fees. He started eating in the main dining group again. And he began eating from completely random trays, deliberately refusing any offers for a safe swap. Word spread through the unit like wildfire: Carter isn't paying anymore. The next warning came fast. A folded piece of commissary paper was slipped onto his bunk. On it, 3 words: last free meal. He didn't sleep at all that night. At chow the following evening, Ray stepped into line under the weight of dozens of silent stares. He could feel the observation, the gang lookouts, the anxious inmates, even the distant guards who were pretending not to notice the tension brewing. His tray slid onto the counter: beef patties, rice, and some canned green beans. He took his seat. Across the room, Tone Walker looked directly at him, no expression on his face. Ray picked up his fork and began to eat. Halfway through the meal, he tasted it. It wasn't a flavor exactly, but a burning numbness that started creeping across his tongue. Something was very, very wrong. He froze as the sensation intensified. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Suddenly, he stood up and flipped the tray onto the floor. The dining hall erupted into shouting. Guards rushed over. Other inmates scattered, wanting no part of whatever was happening. Ray collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. His throat felt like he'd swallowed a mixture of sand and bleach. But he didn't lose consciousness. The medical staff arrived just in time. The dose of poison was lighter than lethal. It was a message, not an execution. As Ray lay strapped to a gurney, gasping for air, he saw Tone Walker being pulled away by officers. But he wasn't being arrested, not restrained, just quietly escorted out of the unit, like a guest being shown the door. Within a few hours, Ray was back in his cell. No charges were filed. No news of the incident spread outside the prison walls. No investigation followed. Only one truth remained undeniable. The poisoning had reached directly for the man who was trying to expose it. And the unseen coordinator at the top of the chain now knew exactly who was fighting back. Ray Carter had survived, but his survival had officially painted a target on his back. And he knew, without a doubt, that next time, the dose wouldn't be so small. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. See you in the next one. After the attempt on my life, everything changed. The unit wasn't just afraid anymore. It was aware. Everyone finally understood the poisonings weren't random acts of violence. They were targeted. The idle gossip stopped. Instead, men started paying attention. They watched who disappeared, who was suddenly transferred, who sat alone during meals, isolated by an invisible threat. The kitchen, once a place of routine and clatter, became a silent courtroom. Invisible sentences were handed down without a judge or jury, and the only verdict was survival or sickness. I survived, but survival didn't bring relief. It just raised the stakes. I noticed the guards watching me, not with any sense of protection, but with a tense curiosity, like an audience waiting for the next act of a grim play. A few of the correctional officers even gave me veiled warnings. "Keep your head low," one muttered during a late-night head count, his eyes darting around. I could feel it in the air, a sense of something much bigger approaching, a quiet endgame being set into motion. This new reality forced me to double down. I intensified my efforts with Anthony Reyes and Marcus Pollard. Our small network grew. We brought in 3 more inmates from the kitchen staff, guys who were sick of seeing their peers fall victim to chemical intimidation, tired of the fear that hung over every meal. Together, we started to build the final, missing piece of the puzzle. We knew there had to be an unseen coordinator, someone pulling the strings from above the inmate hierarchy, someone with official power. And we found him. His name was Officer Daniel Cooper. Cooper wasn't a supervisor. He didn't wear a captain's uniform or carry a high-ranking title. He was just a line officer, assigned to the kitchen corridor detail. It was the perfect position, a single post that oversaw both inmate food preparation and, crucially, access to the cleaning supplies. Every single request for industrial solvents, every shipment that came in, passed through his logbook. We looked back at the records we could access. Every time a security camera mysteriously went out, it was during his shift. Every time a surprise inspection was scheduled, Cooper had already rotated his trusted inmate crews out of the kitchen, leaving no one to talk. He had direct control without being in the official spotlight. We started gathering what little evidence we could. I collected dates, shift rosters, and the schedules of the camera blackouts. Anthony used his laundry connections to map the transfer routes of the solvents, tracing them from the supply closets to the kitchen. Marcus, ever observant, documented the subtle manipulation of seating charts at mealtimes, tracking how targets were isolated. Our new recruits in the kitchen recorded whispered conversations about payments, tracing the flow of commissary items and favors that kept the system running. In a place where cell phones are contraband and cameras are deliberately pointed the wrong way, this collection of handwritten notes and memories was the closest thing we had to a real investigation. I knew I had to try one more time to get the truth out. I found a prison volunteer, a counselor who had helped inmates study for their GEDs in the past. She seemed trustworthy. I slipped her a stack of my handwritten reports, the product of weeks of clandestine work. She promised to forward the paperwork to a civilian oversight board in the city, an external body that might actually listen. 2 days later, it happened. I was transferred. It was sudden, with no explanation, no disciplinary write-up, nothing. They moved me into solitary confinement. The official reason was protective custody. But anyone who's been inside knows that isolation cells aren't for protection. They're for erasure. Concrete walls, a constant, humming fluorescent light, and 23 hours a day locked inside. Meals arrived through a small slot in the steel door, unmonitored and unshared. It was the perfect place for the poison pipeline to deliver its final, quiet message. I refused to eat the first 2 meals they delivered. I couldn't trust them. But by the 3rd day, exhaustion and hunger won. They slid in a tray of mac and cheese. I took a few careful, hesitant bites. I waited. Nothing happened. No burning sensation in my stomach. No wave of nausea. The message arrived later, in a different form. A small, folded piece of paper was slipped under my cell door. I unfolded it. The handwriting was rough. Paper don't protect inside. The gangs had contacts that reached far beyond the general population blocks. My reports had been seen. It was a chilling reminder that even the officers weren't the highest power here. In this world, fear still ruled. After 5 days in the hole, just as I was starting to lose hope, I was unexpectedly released back into general housing. Something on the outside had shifted. The volunteer counselor hadn't stayed silent. She had done exactly what she promised. The oversight board had received my reports and escalated the complaint. Questions started reaching the Department of Corrections internal affairs investigators. Command staff, the higher-ups, began scrambling to cover their tracks. Back in the unit, the poison operation had paused, almost overnight. Kitchen rotations were halted. Solvent shipments were frozen. Tone Walker, the enforcer, was suddenly removed from his kitchen duty, officially for rule violations. And Officer Daniel Cooper? He just stopped showing up for his shifts. No one said he was fired or arrested. He just vanished from the roster. The network was unraveling, but it was happening quietly, without any official announcements. I returned to my housing block thinner, exhausted, but alive. I found Anthony and Marcus almost immediately. They filled me in on what I'd missed. Whispers were flying around the facility that outside agencies were circling Rikers now, sniffing around for signs of corruption. But our evidence, the handwritten notes and compiled timelines, was still thin. And in a massive bureaucratic system, thin evidence doesn't lead to justice. It leads to stalls, delays, and quiet internal reviews that go nowhere. That night at Chow, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I dared to eat a full meal. The food was bland, standard prison fare, but it tasted safe. The knot of fear in my stomach finally began to loosen. But the room itself didn't feel peaceful. Across the crowded tables, I saw Anthony. He caught my eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. My blood ran cold. Something was wrong. I understood then. The system, the poison pipeline, hadn't been destroyed. It had only gone quiet. It had retreated into the shadows to wait out the storm. And somewhere, in the unseen corners of this massive institution, whoever remained untouched by the initial fallout was still in power. They were deciding what the next message would be and who it would be delivered to. The war wasn't over. It was just a ceasefire. Ray Carter thought surviving the isolation meant he had seen the worst. He was wrong. The unit was quieter now, a tense, suffocating silence that carried its own unique brand of terror. Every single tray that slid across the counter did so with a chilling precision. Every inmate eyed their neighbors with a deep, gnawing suspicion. The simple act of living had become a high-stakes game. Laughter was gone. Jokes were a distant memory. Meals, something most of us take for granted, became a test of pure observation. Watch carefully, eat carefully, breathe carefully. Because the poisonings hadn't stopped, they had just gone underground. The methods became more insidious. Smaller doses, just enough to cause minor discomfort, a stomach cramp, a splitting headache. These weren't attempts to kill anymore. They were messages. Subtle, cruel reminders of who was really in control. Ray, along with his allies Anthony and Marcus, knew they were living on borrowed time. They couldn't just survive, they had to fight back. For weeks, the trio became amateur detectives in a concrete jungle. They spent every waking moment documenting patterns, their minds sharp, their focus unwavering. They plotted everything. Every food tray that came out of the kitchen, every inmate's reaction, every single shift change, every guard rotation, they mapped it all out. Scraps of paper became their most valuable possession. They had to get evidence this time, something tangible, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. They were building a case, piece by painstaking piece, to expose the entire corrupt network. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their world became. The risk was no longer just a contaminated meal. It was a shiv in the dark, a staged fight, a false accusation. One night, the three of them gathered in a quiet corner of the library, the dim light barely illuminating their scratched notes and smuggled scraps of paper. They whispered, their voices low and urgent. Anthony's eyes darted around the room, paranoia a constant companion. "It's bigger than we thought," he hissed. "This isn't just about the gangs anymore. It's the officers, too. They're in on it. They control the schedules, they cover the tracks. Someone high up wants this silent, wants us all living in fear." He was right. It explained how the operation was so seamless, how the perpetrators were never caught. The guards weren't just turning a blind eye, they were active participants. Ray nodded grimly, the weight of their discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. "We have to finish it," he said, his voice firm. "If we wait too long, someone else dies. Or worse, they frame it on us next. We're the ones asking questions. We're the ones they'll want to silence for good." Their mission had evolved. This was no longer just about exposing a few rogue inmates. It was about taking down a corrupt system from the inside out. So they planned. They waited. They chose their moment with the precision of a surgeon. The next evening, during the dinner service, their plan went into action. Ray took a tray from the line, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Anthony watched his back, a silent guardian angel in a sea of potential enemies. Marcus monitored the entire room, his eyes scanning every face, every movement, every shadow. Everything was set. Ray walked to his usual spot and sat down. He ate slowly, deliberately, making each bite a calculated move. His eyes were his real weapon. He observed Tone Walker across the room, watching for any sign of satisfaction or alarm. He clocked Lucas Dean near the prep line, looking for any communication with the guards. He saw the officers, standing there, pretending not to see anything, their practiced indifference a confession in itself. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The chaotic symphony of the chow hall played on. Then, Ray felt it. A small slip of paper, tucked neatly under his tray. He discreetly pulled it out. The message was simple, stark, and terrifying. For words, written in clean, precise handwriting, no too much. Ray froze. His blood ran cold. The paper wasn't signed. The handwriting wasn't the crude scrawl of an inmate. It was neat, educated. This was from someone with power, someone with connections both inside and outside the prison walls. Someone who had just told him, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was being watched. That they knew. But in that moment of pure, undiluted terror, something inside Ray Carter shifted. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a new, burning resolve. Survival was no longer enough. Just getting through the day wasn't a victory. Justice, exposure, accountability. Those were the only things that mattered now. This wasn't a warning to back off. It was a declaration of war. And Ray was ready to fight. The following week, the world inside Rikers began to shake. The mountain of evidence meticulously collected by Ray, Anthony, and Marcus, including that final, chilling note, reached the oversight board. It was too detailed, too consistent to be ignored. For the first time, the outside world was forced to look at what was happening inside. Investigators finally arrived, their presence sending a shockwave through the facility. The system that had protected the corrupt was now turning against them. Secret cameras, small and unobtrusive, were installed in the kitchens and prep areas. Officers, who once walked with impunity, were now being interviewed under intense scrutiny, their carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. The gang-controlled food lines, once the source of so much power and fear, were disrupted. The operation collapsed. Not entirely, because a darkness like this never truly dies, but it was wounded, broken. Tone Walker and Lucas Dean were moved to separate, high-security units, their influence shattered. Officer Cooper, the linchpin on the inside, was suspended pending a full investigation. Commissary and kitchen inspections became unannounced and frequent, keeping everyone on their toes. Inside the housing block, life slowly, cautiously, began to return to something resembling normal. You could still see the hesitation in the inmates' eyes, the memory of the poison still fresh. But for the first time in a long time, they could eat a meal without the immediate, paralyzing fear that it could be their last. Ray Carter, Anthony Reyes, and Marcus Pollard survived. More than that, they had won. They exposed the rotten core of the system from within, navigating a psychological battlefield where meals had been used as weapons of terror and control. But the story doesn't end there. Because in the dark, forgotten corners of places like Rikers Island, lessons had been learned on both sides. The inmates learned that a few brave people could make a difference. But the corrupt learned something, too. They learned that fear could be engineered, that control could be silent, and that power could be served on a tray. If you thought this story was intense, make sure you share it with everyone who needs to hear it. Smash that like button, let me know what you think in the comments, and hit subscribe so you never miss the dark, gripping stories hiding in plain sight. Trust me, the world behind bars is more twisted than you could ever imagine. Your next favorite true crime story is just one click away.